Well, welcome to session 10 of our Bible study, our Parables Bible study. Today, it's a little different in that we're looking at a parable that is not actually that complicated. It falls in a string of parables, this whole scene where Jesus is having a conversation with certain people. So in that sense, it's got some complications to it, but in general, it's not a super difficult parable to get. But it's certainly a good leaping off point, and I think it connects well to some of what we've studied already. So we have prepared today 2 of the 3 versions of this parable. Matthew also has his own telling of this, and it's clear that they're drawing from what looks like a similar source, but Matthew is so divergent that it needs to be looked at on its own. And that's kind of how Matthew rolls. He has a very different perspective. He is sort of like the theological athlete of all the gospel writers, in that he's always trying to set that bar higher and be really strict. And he's trying to inspire people by using a little bit more of a line of fear and response to encourage them. So in Luke's version and somewhat in Thomas's, it's just a different approach. So that's why we're looking at those 2. If you happened to read all of chapter 14, which I would recommend because it provides some context, what you'll see is that this parable we're looking at today falls in this sort of dinner that Jesus is having at the home of he's eating with Pharisees, okay? And he has just gone into this parable where he's it has to do with the one where, you know, when you go to a house, where do you sit? And don't choose the best seat, but choose the lowest seat so that you might be elevated. And basically what he's doing is he's revealing to them that no matter where you choose to sit, if you're making choices with the aim that you might be promoted, you're still existing in the realm of self-serving kind of self-centeredness. So he kind of reveals that to them in the last parable, where he says, you know, go out and invite the poor, the lame, the blind, the outcast. Those he names that already. So that's the pretext. That's the context that goes into today, what we're looking at. And then we see this intro line here from one of the Pharisees, who says, what does he say? Concerning the happiness of those who participate in the eschatological blanket. And the picture that I see is this sort of him lounging and just sort of, you know, almost with the fans and the grapes. That's sort of what it feels like as this scene is set just prior to our parable. Now, so Jesus has gone from one parable of rejection for the Pharisees to this now next parable, which is also a parable of rejection for the Pharisees. So I can only imagine how fun this dinner really was for them. One of the challenges of this parable, and it's like most of the parables, we just don't know the context. We really don't have any access to where Jesus, the historical Jesus, might have shared this. What really was it? You know, Matthew calls it sort of this king-like banquet. Luke calls it this rich person's feast, and Thomas calls it a dinner. We don't know. Thomas, you never get context because it's just a gospel of sayings, but we really just don't have access. We just have these ways that the different gospel writers have pulled it in to use it to their own purpose. So we'll do the best we can to try to connect with, in particular, Luke today. We'll look at Thomas as a comparison, but really in particular Luke, and sort of see how it lays in terms of his whole narrative and what he's trying to communicate in terms of the message of the kingdom and Jesus' message. So those are sort of my basic introductory comments. Do you have any thoughts or comments initially before we get into the reading portion? Horty, let's unmute. Okay, go ahead.
She's still muted.
Okay, there we go. I think we're aligned.
Okay.
My first thought was he really needs new friends.
Who is he, Jesus or the Pharisee?
The guy that had the dinner.
Yeah, the guy that had the dinner for sure. Yeah. Well, that's part of it. I think that you've said something there, and that's the nature of these parables. On one level, it should sort of stick that little, that little thorn in the side of who is it that we're choosing to hang around with? What's the expectation, even in our own lives? So yeah, that's a good noticing. Anyone else? Bonnie? Oh, hold on. You're still, I don't know what's going on. Still muted.
Okay,
There you go.
as you've mentioned, previously and just recently, how so many of us are so busy all the time and we don't have time, and all these people seem to have an excuse. Now, whether they made up an excuse because they didn't really want to go, or whether they just had so much on their plate they just didn't have time for this guy, I don't know. But it just made me kind of think of that. And if you go to the poor and you go to, they're usually not doing a lot and don't have their calendar full.
Yeah. Well, actually, first of all, your first point is definitely, that's going to be a significant part of what we're doing today, is to sort of see what we can see within these excuses and kind of get behind them a little bit. But then I think if I heard correctly what you finished with, I've actually noted that it's not the people that have sort of free time all the time that end up being the most effective. Sometimes it's people who are the busiest, so to speak, that actually find their organization or their effectiveness in their use of time. I don't know that it's I know that there's, different, we can say different things about different types of busyness, but I think for sure this parable is trying to lift up those things that we focus on, that we give ourselves to, that we attend to, and what the nature of this sort of mission that Christ is calling us toward, how that jives or doesn't jive with our life plans, with our life, what we do. Any other questions or comments? Jim Worley, I love how the fan right now is just sort of set right behind your head, almost in a halo. Anyone else?
That's my beanie.
Oh, yes.
I did have something though.
Sure.
It was the level of the excuses. I think that really kind of struck me. Some may very well have been legit. Others were, I'm not going. And you could really read that into them. Yeah. So I guess that's what I took away is, why aren't they making time for this individual? Or
it's a really important part of this, and it's one of the central pieces here. And I think as we're about to go into the reading, one of the things to keep in mind is that the common sort of etiquette for a party like this, at least as best as I could assess in my research, was that much like today, when you receive an initial invitation and you respond, oh yeah, interested, I'm gonna go, that sort of thing. There's an initial response, and then there's a more specific invite. Okay, it's ready, come now, that sort of thing. So there's, in the context of this parable, if that's true, there's an assumption that there's already been an accepted invitation. They've already said yes to coming. So then it totally brings up, all right, what is this? What are these excuses? What are the nature of them? How legit are they? And what's the assessment within the parable? And we'll see that, I think, pretty clearly. Any other questions or comments? Bertie.
I see this kind of as a mini summary of Jesus' ministry. He first goes to the synagogues where the Pharisees and lawyers would be, and they reject his message. And then he goes to the poor and the lame and those out on the roadway and brings them in, because he's determined to have a full house.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And certainly with the way Luke uses this parable, I do think it aligns very clearly with his sort of movement that he then further develops in Acts. But as far as Thomas goes, it's, again, harder to assess. It's just a different look. There's a bit of a different focus the way Thomas, and we'll do a little comparison of the two as we get into them. But I agree with you. I think you're on to something as far as Luke's use of this parable. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Okay. I like the snowy background, boys. You're not fooling us, though. Okay. Once again, I'm not going to be able to share the screen, so apparently you'll be able to see me reading, but I'm going to slide over to read both the versions that we have to you. So I'm going to start with the Luke version, and then I'll go into the Thomas version. So this is Luke chapter 14, verses 15 to 24. One of the dinner guests, on hearing this, said to him, "Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Then Jesus said to him, "Someone gave a great dinner and invited many. At the time for the dinner, he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is ready now.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a piece of land, and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I've bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to go try them out. Please accept my regrets.' Another said, 'I've just been married, and therefore I cannot come.' So the slave returned and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and said to his slave, 'Go out at once into the streets and the lanes of the town, and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' And the slave said, 'Sir, what you ordered has been done, and there is still room.' Then the master said to the slave, 'Go out into the roads and the lanes and compel people to come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those who were invited will taste my dinner.'" And now Thomas 64. Jesus said, "A man had guests, and when he had prepared the dinner, he sent his servants to invite them. He went to the first and said to him, 'My master invites you.' He said, 'I have money with some merchants. They're coming to me this evening. I will go and give them my orders. I ask to be excused from the dinner.' He went to another and said to him, 'My master invites you.' He said to him, 'I have bought a house, and I am asked for a day. I shall not have time.' He went to another and said to him, 'My master invites you.' And he said to him, 'My friend is about to be married, and I am to arrange the dinner. I shall not be able to come. I ask to be excused from dinner.' He went to another and said to him, 'My master invites you.' And he said to him, 'I have bought a farm, and I'm going to collect the rent. I shall not be able to come. I ask to be excused.' The servant came back and said to his master, 'Those whom you have invited to dinner have asked to be excused.' The master said to his servant, 'Go out to the roads, bring those whom you find, that they may dine. Traders and merchants shall not enter the places of my Father.'" Okay, so initial thoughts, initial connections, or what are the similarities and the differences that sort of jump out at you between those two? Nothing? Oh, Bonnie, go ahead.
Well, one difference was that one guy said he had just gotten married. The other one said that he was invited to a wedding where he was in charge of the dinner. So it wasn't he himself that was being married.
Yeah, it's a difference there, but he's in charge of preparing the dinner for the wedding. Yeah. Yep. Marilyn and then Carol.
I was thinking they're the same in that nobody says, "Oh yes, I'll come." You know, they all They all have excuses and they aren't going to come. So from that standpoint, they're the same. Where they differ a little bit is that some of the excuses are different.
Right. Is there a connection between all the excuses in the Thomas version versus the Luke one? Do you see connections that are within one? Is there a theme that runs through? Carol?
My feeling, especially the way you read it, was almost like each one was trying to be a little more pompous and a little more wealthy and a little more elite as their reasons for not coming, because each of them had something far better or far more elaborate to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there seems to be certainly an expression of self-importance and these things that are really all of these excuses. Well, I guess not the wedding one necessarily, but a lot they really come out of means. You have to have means to buy, real estate or cattle like this. So it's sort of, these are sort of the wealthier or the more upstanding citizens that are responding here, for sure. Any other differences that you're noticing here? Jim?
What the significance of the very last statement in Thomas says, traders and merchants shall not. Nowhere in the people that he invited did it bring that up. And now all of a sudden at the end, it's plow. There's traders and merchants, and there's got to be some significance to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. And while it is hard to sort of assess all the full range of what Thomas might be meaning, one thing that you will note is that all four excuses in Thomas do have to do with the management of money. And even the wedding one, you might say, well, no, he's organizing a dinner, which certainly involves, think about being the one in charge of organizing a wedding feast now. That certainly involves a lot of coordination and finances. So there is that element of management of money. Kathleen, and then Marilyn. Oh, I'm sorry, Kathleen, and I don't see. Yeah, I just saw your hands, Marilyn. Go ahead, Kathleen.
It's muted. Can you hear me?
There you go. Yep.
Okay. Well, Perry and I are just chatting here, and we're saying how, gosh, we go to something and come home, and maybe I'll see you, Dan, and I'll tell you a story about what happened there. And oh, shoot, those people didn't come because they were invited to a wedding. Well, Perry would say something, oh, they got married. We're hearing different stories, and I think we should expect differences from different people that tell the story.
Absolutely. I think there's certainly different perspectives within that. But I do think, sometimes we hear these parables and the parable itself doesn't seem to evaluate the response. It just sort of lays it out there. This parable, I think, is making more of an evaluation, making more of a judgment on
those people.
Excuses. Yeah, well, on the excuses for sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's different than some of the other ones we've been looking at in that regard. Horty.
Okay. Previously, you have cited that there's been some rather disparaging points of view of merchants. And he says no merchants or businessmen or whatever it is, those people that exchange in commerce. Excellent. Or that once again have something to do with money.
Yes. And if that is the case, and again, we're not positive, but you're right that sometimes that word that is translated as merchant can have certain connotations. And if that's the case, it may be referencing those types of merchants that are so enamored with their buying and selling. And that has become their sort of identity and overly identified. And that would make sense. That would make sense here, but we just don't have that definitive information. But I tend to agree with you as far as that goes. Oh.
It provides some continuity of, as you said, each of the excuses seems to have some financial basis. And then he talks about people that it won't be the merchants, and it just felt like it had some continuity there.
Yes. And then there's go ahead, Perry.
So Kathleen says, I've got a snotty comment to make.
Well,
And
we
my
need
comment
more of
is,
those. You know, we got to spice these Bible studies up.
so, maybe this fellow that was having the dinner had a reputation for bad food and bad wine.
Well, there are some scholars that speculate that it was one of those situations where they got an initial invitation and then they saw who else was invited. So it maybe didn't have to do with the rich man, but they saw who was on the guest list, and then they sort of made assessments that, yeah, well, it's not worth my time. And that, again, totally speculative, but I also can appreciate how modern that is and how we may understand what that is all about. But and the beauty of this parable is that we really don't have to understand fully those dynamics, because I think it expresses what it's trying to express regardless. You know, that there's something going on and these people are making choices that are opting for their excuses over this dinner party. Okay, so Horty.
It gets back to what we've discussed, it feels to me, in so many of the other parables. And it comes down, what is the motivation of the decision that you make?
Yes.
Why did he invite those people? Why did they not come? Why did the others come? Why did he, it's about the motivation of the decisions and the choices, it seems to me.
Yes. And I think it's about, and it'll come to another assessment too, but your motivation, absolutely. Yeah, because you can be a merchant and still be someone that's on the path. But the way that Thomas puts it, the way that that parable has seemed to be shaped has to do with, they've sealed themselves off from responding to the invitation because they are so rooted in their own sort of management of finances, their own excuses, their own reality. And that's part of the dynamic that these parables are always inviting us into. What's your ultimate reality? What do you ultimately give yourself to? What possesses you? Those types of questions. There is, go ahead, Marilyn.
I love the idea that this could sort of represent certain aspects of Jesus's life and how he gathered people together. And it could help explain why it is that he's got fishermen and, he has people kind of analogous to the people out on the road. Who are the ones who finally get invited because everybody else, I'm just too busy for this.
Yes. I think that is the way Luke is shaping it. He's really laying it out there as a means of communicating. This is how it came to be, that the message of Jesus was presented in the way it was and to the people it was, or that the focus was, because you end up being more fertile ground in certain capacities, in certain realities, and the gospel stories, they go into all that detail about, okay, well, what is that fertile ground? What does it look like? And we can understand that sometimes the trappings of this world can harden our soil and make it difficult for the ways of God to take root. Barbara Tillman.
I'm going back to my Sunday school days, I guess, when I read this, and my initial take on it is that he's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he's telling them, you're too busy for me. You're not going to listen to what I say. I'm coming for the poor and the oppressed instead. And that's my take. Or that was my take anyway. I'm open to new ideas.
Barbara, I would love to write a letter to your Sunday school teacher and thank him or her for that, because that is not what I would call the most typical reading of this parable. And that historically, especially when you look at Matthew, it is viewed as a rejection of a much broader class of people, and that's unfortunate. But what you just said, I believe, is exactly the way it's intended. And that is, it's not a rejection of an entire race or nation, but a specific type of people within that, within the religious leadership, the ones who keep rejecting, the ones that sort of present themselves like this. And you're right. This whole context is a dinner with Pharisees. He's talking to Pharisees, and so And what is Luke always doing? He's sort of picking on the Pharisees and the lawyers. Again, not because historically that was accurate. It's not. Pharisees were not the way they're characterized in these Gospels. You need to say that. But this is a story. This is a means of communicating a truth, and those characters are used as sort of the antagonist to promote the message that Luke's trying to convey. Steve, I saw your hand. I did a lot of talking. Do you still have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, it just seems to me that the host of the party has not God's work or Jesus' work in his heart, when the last statement is kind of spiteful for the people that didn't show up.
Yeah. Particularly in the Thomas one, or in both of them?
Actually, it appears in both, but it's
both. Yeah.
the one that I see is.
Read the Matthew one, and it's even more harsh. But again, that's a completely different thing, and it's got. But yeah, again, parables do these things to sort of to make us stand up and pay attention, and sort of, there's different meanings for that. But yeah, it's a pretty harsh conclusion. But at the end of the day, much like what we saw with the unforgiving servant, is it God or the rich person who's doling out the consequence, or is it the people by their choices who bring it on themselves? And that is something that, we can have a conversation about as far as what the parable's saying. But I want to say this. Oh, go ahead, Ken.
Just the way the story is told, it's as if the people who were invited did not give a reply, and so the servant had to go and give a reminder to them, because the message is, we haven't heard back from you, and the banquet's ready. You need to come now if you're coming.
Yeah, I think that's it. While it's hard to know whether that's true or whether what I said earlier is true, that the custom was to kind of do an initial invite and maybe you respond, maybe you don't. But I think what you're on to is that it almost doesn't matter what they knew or what they did. What comes across is that there is a self-importance. It's almost, there's an insult that's behind these excuses. That it's not about whether or not they're actually viable, but each one of them in their own way is insulting. And in fact, when you look at the Luke excuses, how are each one of them kind of insulting? For example, go ahead, Bonnie, and then Steve.
Well, I don't know if they implied or they just outright said, I've got something better to do than to show up for your dinner, which I would say is kind of insulting.
Yeah, I mean, none of them on the face of it is a really legit excuse. First of all, it's not customary to go out and buy land like that sight unseen and then have to go check it out, or to buy cattle sight unseen and then want to go run them in the field or something. And the whole idea of a wedding, this is not a time of eloping. This is a time where that would have been a process that was well planned. It was a community event in most instances. So these would not be something that would have been a surprising, I just didn't, so it might have been along the lines of what Ken was saying, whether it was just negligence to respond or one way or another. But there's an insulting underlying quality to all of these, that they just, either they knew about this ahead of time and just didn't care to respond, or they said they could go knowing that they had all this, or it's just it's a slap in the face of the person inviting. That's part of the intention here, is it's double-edged here. But there's also something else, and I wonder if your study Bibles would indicate this, and it has to do with, are these excuses simply random, or is there a pretext or an intertext or historical connection to these specific excuses? Did any of your study Bibles go into that? the first comment that the Pharisee makes, you know, that in my version said something like, it's good to eat in the kingdom of God, or something like that. The literal translation of that, or maybe in your translations, would be more like, happy are those that get to attend the Messianic banquet. And that Messianic banquet is an image that's in Isaiah and in some of the apocryphal literature. It's in Revelation. It's this idea that this image of the invitation of God to that eternal banquet, you know, and we all get to argue about who's really invited, you know, and this parable is partly about that. But there's this image within Israel of that sort of representing, you know, what it'll be like in the day of the Lord, or, you know, in the life to come, kind of thing. So that idea of a Messianic banquet, so that comment that the Pharisee initially makes may be kind of related to that. Then if you look at in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 5-7, and I put this in the notes, there's some interesting comments about who is excused from serving in a holy war. Okay, a war that, you know, others would normally be called to serve. And the excuses have to do with those who buy land, those who get married, those who get livestock, those sorts of things. And there's also reference to those who are excused. The blind, the lame, the poor, the outcast are also excused from serving in the holy war. Okay, so there's this connection of excuse there. But then there's also something else that in and around that Deuteronomy passage and in other texts that talk about what else they're excluded from. And as they're excluded from holy war, they're also excluded from the holy banquet, or the Messianic banquet. In the Qumran texts, the ones that were found, I believe that's the Essene texts back in, now I can't remember, was that the 40s? Anyway, the Qumran texts were indicated some of this about who was excluded from that Messianic banquet. So if that's some of the background in this, it has then more to do with, all right, so the way you've all got it set up here in your religious eliteness and your expectations about who's invited to the banquet and who's excluded, you might just be a little bit off base. Horty?
Because the parable begins with that man's statement, blessed are they, it almost like, well, we're all here at this dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Aren't we sort of the chosen ones?
Yeah.
And right. That then he says, well, let's just look at it as a possible teaching tool.
Exactly. And that's what's so, I think, interesting about the whole movement of the invitation and the rejection. Because he's basically, if that's true, and again, it's not like a slam dunk, but it seems to be, scholars have noticed the connection between that Deuteronomy passage about the holy war and then some other reference to the Messianic banquet. There seems to be connection. It's not totally linear. But if that's true, then the way this plays out is a distinct challenge to the expectations that the Pharisees and the religious leadership would have had as to who is in and who is not included. And it's exactly what you think it is. It's always Jesus flipping everything on its head, is essentially it. Okay. So when you look at Luke's invitations, you know, and Barbara Tellman kind of addressed some of this, but in each case, the invitation seems to fit with Luke's kind of movement of his entire narrative. So if that's the case, what does each sequence of who's invited and then the rejection or the acceptance, who do these people represent? So who are the first ones invited in Luke? Who do they represent for Luke?
Landowners?
Certainly the upright and the elite, but I'd go even further. I think it has to do with what Barbara was saying. It's not just the landowners, but those would be the expected ones, like the Pharisees, the lawyers, the wealthier class. Okay, the ones that in that day were held up to be the most upright, the most deserving. So that would be that class of people. Okay. Then the next invitation is the poor, the outcast, the blind, the lame, all of those. Where did that come from? Why would they invite those people?
Because they're excluded from society.
Yes. What else? Why else would they specifically invite those people?
Those are the people for whom he performed miracles.
Yeah, those are the ones that Jesus, from the beginning, from his first sermon, and that's the one he said, this is who the message is for. So I'm telling you that you need to, this is really, these are the ones who will get it. These are the ones that my Father is reaching out to. This is who the message is for now. Okay, so there's that second one. But then it says, but there's still more room. So let's go out to the byways and the highways and all these other things, the town squares, and who do those people represent? The last invitation. Jay?
Would it be the Gentiles?
Yeah. In Luke's narrative, that's sort of the way it moves. There's this initial invitation, there's a rejection, there's a movement to those who are the poor and the outcast, there's a reception, and then there's a continued movement toward those outside of Israel, which is what the book of Acts, kind of really gets into. But here's the thing. Who are the ones who are cast out then? We've kind of already named this. I just want to be very clear about it. Who are the ones who are cast out? I saw, Marilyn and then Horty.
Yeah, he says that none of the men who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.
Right. So who are those people who are not going to get a taste?
Well, the higher ups in the society.
And we've established that, I hope, but the religious elites, the Pharisees and the lawyers, will not get a taste. Unfortunately, too often when some of us receive this story, especially if you read the Matthew version, it's what we get is, it's a rejection of Jews. It's a rejection of the Jews in general. And within the parable, we know that's not true, because the poor, the outcast, the blind, the lame, they are Jews. Mm-hmm. However marginalized they are, within the context of the parable, they're still Jewish. They're still Jews. So it's important to really to just name that, because unfortunately that's one of those areas where historically this parable, but particularly the Matthew version, has been used as a way of a blanket statement of all Jews, when this the context is it's a dinner with the Pharisees, so it's spoken to the leaders and it's for the leaders. This is a parable of rejection, again, in a sequence of them at this really fun dinner that must have been, as Jesus is basically just lambasting them the whole time. Yeah. But that's the nature, and that's how Luke rolls. The whole gospel is sort of like, here's a parable of affirmation, and here's a parable of rejection. Here's what, so it's like, I'm going to speak to the disciples, now I'm going to speak to you Pharisees, now I'm going to speak. That's just how Luke goes through. So it's part of the rhythm of Luke's gospel. Any other questions or comments so far? Steve?
I just wanted to ask if this was the house of a Pharisee and they are pretty strict about following the Jewish traditions, why would he plan a wedding on the Sabbath? I believe it's on the Sabbath that this is taking place. So.
Why would he plan a wedding? One of the people, in the parable or?
Well, earlier in the parable, it says it's the house of a ruler belonging to the Pharisees.
Right.
So I assumed that this was,
Yeah.
I assumed this wedding was part of this plan.
But the wedding you're referring to is the example from the parable?
Yes, the one from the parable. Not
Okay.
the same.
Yeah, that's just an illustration to for a different purpose. Yeah, there's not a connection necessarily between the parable wedding and then the feast that they're having together. But it's an illustration, I think, that is meant to be insulting. And I don't remember seeing if that wedding was planned for the Sabbath or whatnot, but it certainly was set up as something that it's an entanglement that the righteous and the upright ones who should have known better allowed themselves to be caught up in, essentially. Jim.
Hey, just one question. He's at this dinner with the Pharisees, and it seemed like always they were, at loggerheads. And so why would Jesus be invited to this dinner if it weren't to entrap him in some way or, make him look bad?
Yeah.
So I guess all of a sudden that just popped into my head. Why was he at this dinner in the first place? What was the underlying reason to invite him and have him at this dinner? And, there's no timing here. I mean, was he a younger lad at this point, or was this later in his life where he was?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. In, I think, almost every instance, maybe barring one, throughout Luke, every encounter with Pharisees is antagonistic. It is so going in that it is not sort of a friendly, something you can trust on the face of it, that there's going to be something underneath that they're conniving, that they're looking to do to trap him. So I think that's a given when we see this. Now, Jesus is constantly put in positions to interact with all sorts of different people. Whether or not that actually happened, we don't know. But the way Luke is presenting this is a means of communicating that understanding or that truth, that the ones who are supposed to get it, that society expected, had it all figured out, were precisely the ones who didn't. So that's the truth that's being communicated. This world is upside down, and God's turning it upside down. And the way we expect things to happen, and the people we expect to be included and to get it and to be in the right, it's not necessarily according to God's ways of seeing things. Who do you identify with when you read this parable? Who do you find yourself, connecting to of the three different groups? Or do you find yourself feeling connected to any of them? Do you do that? Do you put yourself in a role, or do you find it just naturally happens? Sometimes, go ahead, Barbara.
Well, I always feel guilty when I read this parable because I put myself in with the people who were born into a life that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And so I think he's talking to me. And he's telling me that I need to get my priorities straight on how I relate to all humanity in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, I resonate with that. I find when I read this parable, I tend to put myself in the position of the first group. Anyone else? And why, if you can, like Barbara did, just sort of a little bit, like a little background as to, well, what is it that you connect with? And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but these parables always provoke that within us. They ask us to sort of identify with certain aspects. Horty, did I see you? And then Ken.
Excuse me. I identify with the second group because I feel so broken and in need of healing.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of us can relate to as well. We don't feel like we're part of sort of this privileged class or this ones that are supposed to get it, but that for whatever reason, life circumstances, we feel like we're on the outside. So that's a really hopeful kind of, or an inspiring approach to this parable, that there's a place for me in my brokenness. Ken?
as a minister and as a church leader, I identify with the servant's role of offering the invitation again and again and getting excuses.
Yes. That's it, buddy. And I think that's another powerful one to intersect with. And as all of us understand, I think the longer you do church, we're throwing seeds all the time, and we're out inviting, and we're out, and you can't control what the response is, but I think a lot of us can appreciate what Ken just said, for sure. And if you don't understand what we're talking about, I'd love you to serve on the nominating committee for this coming year, and then you'll get it. Okay. So what else does this parable provoke? What else? What do you think ultimately it is about, or some of the things that it's about? Jay.
I see it all as kind of whatever the excuse is. It may be a legitimate excuse. It's just that, are you going to prioritize in the name of God, or are you going to prioritize what's good for you? Of course, that's not what's good for God should be good for you, but your own self-interest.
Right.
You fail to prioritize what you do in your daily life around what God expects you to do or wants you to do.
Can you do both?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's proved, even in your life, I think it's proved over and over again that you set priorities in your life that is more in line with, I think, what God expects or wants. That you take care of your family, you love your kids, you do what's expected, and you manage your daily life. But the first priority is always to try and accept his invitation. That's all.
It's a hard one. I think this parable is pretty tough, and it is asking us to prioritize. And I think that within ourselves, we all know, what our real priorities are, and we know what our best intentions are.
Yeah.
A lot of times we know what our hopes and our words would proffer, but truth be told, sometimes our priorities are not in alignment with our stated intention. And so
many times, or most of the time.
Yeah, and that's a given, and it's not I'm not saying that as a finger pointing judgment, but this is truth. And so this parable, I think, is acknowledging that and saying, can you really speak out of both sides of your mouth there and have it go the way you think it should, you want to? I think this parable is pretty tough on that.
Yeah.
And it's like, you can give yourselves to your possessions or your people, or you can give yourselves to God. But I don't know, based on what this parable is talking about. And again, who's it talking to? It's talking to the Pharisees. So they're the ones that are coming from this more self-righteous attitude. But it's really naming something that's pretty harsh, and there's no getting around that.
Yeah.
So that's one of it. That's certainly one of the messages. It's a tough choice, and only within ourselves do we really know, where those priorities are. So it's challenging us, and that's one to chew on. It's one to chew on. It's not comfortable, but that's one we're all asked to chew on. The recent events with George Floyd have been ones that have lifted up a whole consciousness within white America of what privilege looks like, of what the impact of staying silent is. And I'm not saying it's for the first time. I think in all of your lives, you've had moments that have really kind of finally awoken the greater consciousness to pay attention to things as they are and notice things differently. But that's certainly one of the things I've noticed, is that's been one of those wake-up calls to see, how is it that we're saying we're living our lives, you know, whether in me as an individual or us as a country, and how is it really playing out? And are those in alignment? Is it really in alignment with this vision that that Jesus is talking about, that we say we're following, we're part of? I don't have a good answer, except to say, in terms of, I don't know what the yes is to that. I know what the no is, and I think there's a lot of ways that we're not doing it. But to say, okay, well, we're not doing it here, but this is what it looks like. That's a tougher response. But right now, it's just to see clearly, where is it that we have been in alignment with the message of Jesus, and where have we not been as individuals and as a society? This parable asks us to look at those hard places, those raw places. And it says, you got to make a choice. You can't do both. And that's kind of like that last line. If you went further, it has to do with the salt, you know, and it's like salt that, what does it say? Salt that's without its flavor, you know, it doesn't, you can't do both. You can't give yourself to both. It's like salt that has no flavor. And what do you do with that? You toss it out. And again, the parable is not trying to say toss into the eternal flames. It's not saying that, but it's saying that if you try to speak out of both sides of your mouth, ultimately you're convicting yourself. And the invitation is not up to you, right? God invites all, but the response is. And this parable is so, you know, it gets under our skin if we let it, because it's going to poke at us and say, all right, here's what Jesus is saying, you know, how are your choices? How are my choices? You know, my priorities lining up with that? Questions or comments? Carol.
I was taken by the last line when he says, go beyond the boundaries, like to the Gentiles, to the other nations. And I always feel I'm doing a great job, but it's within my church, within my family. How do I get beyond that to an even deeper level?
Yeah.
And that's where I found the challenge.
Yeah. I think it's often about, you know, we have these circles of comfort in which we operate, and Jesus is constantly inviting us to step across that perceived barrier into the next zone, the next wider circle. And I think that's a beautiful way to live, because it may not work for you to just take a giant leap out. You know, you might have to take the steps of just saying, all right, I'm starting with my family, then I'm starting with my social group, then it's my church, you know, then it's what? But it's that process of growing and moving and challenging and pushing yourself that way. I think that's partly what that parable is asking us to do. That you just, if you're staying comfortable, if we're not moving, then we're not growing. And then it's hard to be really fully in alignment with what Jesus is talking about. Because if one thing we know about Jesus, he was constantly on the move. Okay. And that movement was not just for the story and like, here, we're just going to, it's really a metaphor for the life of faith. It is the way. It is not the seat. It is not the singular place. It's a way of being and moving. Other questions or comments? Horty?
Back to the statement of choices. We've been told previously you cannot serve two masters.
That's right. That's right. And it's similar to the last week's, you know, where we learned that this unforgiving servant thing, that it, you know, the whole system, the imperial system, was something that needed to be overturned, and that God's system of assessment is different than that of the world. This is the same thing. The systems of assessment, the systems of deciding who's in and what it means to be upright and righteous, these categories mean nothing to Jesus, and they mean nothing to God. And if we are stuck in that way of being that's like, all right, follow the rules, tell me what I need to do and I'll do them, then we're not really able to sort of get on board with what, you know, these challenging messages that Jesus is talking about, where we really are asked to turn and see each other to see those people that we commonly labeled outcast. No, they're not. There's no such thing as outcast anymore. They're all neighbor. And until that's something that's deeply embedded in us, it's our way of seeing each other, then it's hard for us to really kind of prioritize the way Jesus is talking about. Because that's what the Pharisees always did, you know, that, or at least the way they're characterized in these stories. They're all about, you know, having arrived, that they know what to expect. And how many people do I talk to? Oh, I don't go to church, but I know where I'm going. You know, I know what's up. I know what I'm doing. And it's like as if that's what it's about. And, you know, and that's not just for people who don't go to church. I think there's a lot of people who do attend and are part of communities that really struggle with that. And I think that's a natural struggle that we all are facing. And these parables kind of say, all right, then don't get lost in that. Don't get stuck. Keep on moving. You know, and what does that look like? Carol asked the question. All of us ask the question, how do we broaden that circle, you know, the way Jesus does? You know, and that's provocative, and it should be uncomfortable. Again, if we're uncomfortable, we're on to something with these parables, okay? If we're assessing them and saying, all right, how can I interpret this to meet my own reality so that I don't have to do anything, then we probably missed it. Okay, any other closing comments for today? Hearing none. Oh, there's Marilyn.
You started today by saying that this parable was going to be sort of more straightforward and kind of it maybe wasn't going to be so difficult to understand. I think there was a lot there. I think the things that you just said and that we've been talking about, and how that can make us uncomfortable, and how do we make these decisions, and in some ways that almost seems like the center to me.
I agree. I guess I should have said it better. I think this parable in some ways is simple to understand, but not easy. Not easy to do, not easy to live. It's a theme that a lot of us know, you know. How do we prioritize our lives? To whom do we give our deepest self? What possesses us, the Spirit of God or the spirit of things or even people? All of these challenges, not hard, you know, we've heard them before, but living them, totally different story, totally different story. And that's part of our own, you know, self. It's a process of discernment, of wisdom, of individual analysis, and kind of constant reevaluation, but also communally. How do we do that as people within different social structures and in our church? So,
well, it's very, it comes from the story. I mean, our conversation comes from what we read. Yeah. And I just, you know, I was sort of thinking, God, I could come up with, I'm sure, a whole bunch of stories that didn't lead to this kind of conversation.
That's why we do this. It's why I enjoy it so much, because it really is this sort of, we're all sort of out there walking and just you know, figuring our path out together and where we are, you know, helping each other stay on the move, helping each other see things, helping each other notice things that maybe we hadn't before, all that. So yeah, that's part of the greatness of this work together. And then now, hopefully it's something that will leave you something to chew on, to continue to navigate, to help you see your own life, your own intersection with these themes, you know, how they come up day to day, because they do. All right. Well, thank you all. Next week we'll continue. Does anyone need any updates on the schedule? Did you all see that from Barbara? Yeah. Okay. If you need it, please just contact the church office. But we're going to be meeting for 3 more weeks. I've got 3 more stories. And so for next week, it's Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. And it's that famous parable, the laborers in the vineyard. All right, everyone. Thank you again for being here. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.